Well, good afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to be here in Berlin and here at ESMT. I had a great privilege to sit in on the morning sessions. I don't have quite a joke like I heard this morning from Dr. Shea, but we'll do fine, I think, talking about education. This is an important conversation. As we think about digitalization, as we think about the preparedness for companies to transform, one of the lenses we need to use is, are we prepared with the folks, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the leaders in our companies and fueling our companies in country to drive that digitalization vision? In many ways, we have to rethink the lens we're using in the classroom. In many cases, we look at our achievement in classrooms based on test scores or PISA rankings, graduation rates, college enrollment rates. We've got to shift our thinking to say, are we preparing our economic future? Do we have leaders fueling our companies? Do we have employment gaps? Are you as employers struggling to find leaders and employees to fuel your vision and innovations? If we look at youth unemployment across Europe, across the world, the answer is clear. The answer is unfortunately no. We have many countries who have a significant gap between the needs of the employers and the production coming from university. So we need to think about the education lens deeply here, not only as it relates to fueling the digital dreams, whether it's autonomous vehicles or security and privacy is important as it relates to data. We've got to think about shifting our expectation and raising our expectations for what's going on in the classroom. And in many ways, the digital future starts in the classroom today. It's also important to recognize the economic future is connected and deeply connected to our success and focus on education. This is one of the reasons why in my travels globally, I get a chance, and really one of the pleasures of my job is I get a chance to visit with countries who are all thinking about this focus on education. And they're doing so because of an economic imperative. And this is an imperative that's not assured any longer. In a world of the past and industrialized nations, the progress and the performance was much more steady and much more assured and sustained. But digitalization opens up economic fluctuation that was unprecedented before. Countries have big dreams to unseat countries like Germany, US, other economic powers with their growth. The six of the 10 largest economic growing countries are in Africa. 41% of the employment population in the world will be in Africa in 30 years. So the country leaders, the education ministers that I talk to in Uganda and Rwanda are pushing pictures up of Seoul, Korea, who 50 years ago looked very similar to their countries. And they're seeing the potential for economic growth through technology to drive change and prosperity in their countries. This creates both an exciting future, but a focus that's needed to happen in Germany and other parts of the world on education foundation. This is not only an important conversation, but a necessary one to drive this future. And in many ways, as it relates to education, we've got to actually aspire to more than digitalization. As you saw the presentation before, we talked to the example of autonomous cars. The reason why that's important is because it has a real need in society, it has a real value. We talked about the ability for your car to find you, the implications on society, etc. That's rigor that industry provides to technology decisions, the costs, the benefits, the implications on staff and people. I would say the journey in the last 20 or 30 years in classrooms has not applied that same level of thought and rigor to the adoption of technology. Technology has been an end goal. Country leaders talk about digitizing textbooks or providing devices to children as the end of the spectrum. And in many ways, that's led to classrooms that are underutilizing technology and has significantly stalled progress because they haven't thought through the people implications of the change. And in many ways, we've talked historically about a digital divide across nations, with access to the internet, access to technology, access to this world of information that all of us are participating in as the challenge. And I see the current challenge and the future challenge is a new digital divide. And the digital divide is based on how do we leverage this digitalization opportunity to drive real outcomes and real impact, supporting heroes and learners in the classroom to do more. And that's been a gap that I think we struggle with. One of the pleasures I have around the world when I visit classrooms is I get a chance to get escorted to a specific classroom often. Maybe it's in Germany, where I see an amazing teacher, professor, transforming, using digitalization to really fundamentally transform what they're doing in the classroom. Unfortunately, though, that's often a very specific path to that classroom. I've learned in my trips to kind of use a restroom break to explore the classrooms of the school or the other faculty and what they're doing inside of a university. But often someone from the tour will come running after me and say that there's no need for me to look into that classroom because there's nothing special going on there. And that's the reality of what's happening with digitization. This is true in companies, it's certainly true in education, that it's not shared equally. We've got to shift the culture inside organizations to understand what digitization means. How are you setting the foundation for employees, the expectation of success, the need to share and collaborate as a foundation for change? We have examples of changing classrooms across Germany, across the world, but the smallest points of focus is where the biggest and fastest innovation is happening. When you scale out an innovation to a school, it doesn't look as good. If you scale it out to a town or state, it's not as pervasive. Certainly at a country level, it's hard to find. And the number one question I get asked is which countries are doing it well? And the reality is it's hard to point to a country. There may be amazing things in Finland that they're doing to create an expectation of the value of teachers in society, or the expectation on secondary education that's happening in Korea, driving outcomes and performance. But usually it's not done pervasively, it's not shared uniquely. And we've got to think about this digitization future as one that must be and equally shared across all students, across all learners, across all companies as it relates to the future, and really thinking about that from a culture standpoint as well, which is really, really critically important. When we think about this transition as it relates to Microsoft, certainly the role of education in this future is important. And as I've seen through technology's emergence in classrooms, and really a parallel to digitization and how to think about it, technology has been an outcome, and certainly talked about it being an endpoint. And it creates questions. You put a device in, you put access to data in, people will question. How do I use it? How do I get access to it? Is it safe? Who controls it? Maybe data that's disconnected from other data that creates more confusion and missed opportunity and potentially more complexity for institutions. In many cases, technology can solve these issues. A shift to digitization holistically can solve these issues. But it's often the people cultural issues that are the most important. Giving a foundation for people to open up with innovation, to understand the need to share, the need to trust, and the need to set clear policies on alignment with transparency so everyone contributes. We see that struggle in classrooms. And I can see that while we are different from place to place, there's a universal focus on education, an urgency for change, a shared belief on the need to transform, not just to digitize, but to transform how learning is taking place. But then the other thing is shared, it's a challenge. And it's a challenge not because of budgets or technology, it's a challenge because of people. Readiness, talent, the commitment, and the capacity for leaders to embrace this change. So as you think about digitization, not only think about that culture inside of your organizations, but understand the imperative of building a connection to your education system. Both building trust and relationships with universities, supporting the work that's going on across Germany on policy for classrooms is critically important. We also see this changing the dynamics in classrooms as it relates to the current debate or trend in classrooms on skills versus content. And there's a war waging that you may or may not realize in schools based on the philosophy of teaching curriculum, and the learning paradigm historically from hundreds of years ago has been built around content, which historically has been limited to individuals and resources, to skills, leadership, creativity, collaboration, certainly critical thinking as a skill, and increasingly computational thinking as a skill. And that debate is often rooted by needs to keep people understanding the basics of history or science, mathematics, and others who believe that the connection to life skills, employability skills, entrepreneurship, grit, is the real focus and function of education. I don't see that as a conflict. I see actually when you understand algebra as a subject and a discipline on its own, students around the world will raise their hand and say, what does this have to do with the real world? When you see algebra as a foundation for building and learning abstract thinking and applying abstract thinking to other disciplines, to advanced mathematics and other pursuits, not only do students like algebra more, they're more excited to apply it to solving real-world problems. And this is the shift that we have to make with digitization. It's certainly people first. The other war that's waging in classrooms is the use of data and analytics. I will say that the aspiration again here is too shallow. In many countries, in many schools, the aspiration is to display data of performance history. We want to see how our students are performing. In many cases, we're just getting a great picture of students failing or dropping out of school. What we've got to do is transform the way in which data is driving insight and shifting learning opportunities. How do we extend learning beyond the classroom, but learning in a different way? How do we personalize deeply the learning journey for every student? How do we use data to guide an educator to support a student's success versus monitor a student's progress? That's a fundamental shift. It doesn't require better database tools or cloud infrastructure. It requires leaders to think differently, systems to connect openly, and real focus on how do we use data and insights and analytics to not fundamentally only teach differently, but build content, build connection differently and more powerfully. And that's something that's exciting. The other opportunity that I think we're facing as it relates to digitization in education is the potential for new media, augmented reality, virtual reality, games in the classroom. And this is not only creating new opportunities, new canvas for digital narratives and emotional connection, more immersion, but it's going to enable a deeper connection for actually how do we connect education to real skills, specifically vocational education institutions who can actually now provide insight and guidance in a digital and virtual way to experience careers and situations in a much more real way than ever before. So the industry connection to education there is also important. Lastly, I want to end with just a connection. This is a people pursuit, thinking about how do we prepare students for the future jobs, entrepreneurs to fuel the economy, and increasingly, an education success for me is not capacity to fill jobs, it's the ability to create jobs. There are countries who are aspiring to fill jobs that exist today, and certainly we need to create countries who have entrepreneurs building jobs for the future. This is people-centric. The other people-centric piece is getting our confidence across our school leaders and celebrating with optimism teachers. There's too much pessimism in education. Faculty are frustrated because of the pressures of change from students. School teachers in K-12 education who are pressured on outcomes from mayors or state officials or even the press on driving change versus results on benchmarks that are maybe in many cases archaic. And we need to not only celebrate that optimism, but celebrate it with urgency. Education has been a force of education and economic growth in the past. I gave examples of Korea as a source of inspiration. I'll give a source of comparison. In 1965, when Singapore and Jamaica both became independent states, they both had different paths to choose. Jamaica decided to focus on their natural resource, which was tourism, to drive their GDP growth and the future of the country. Singapore said, we've got to have an economic future, drive a digital future for the country, and build that future and foundation in education. In the first 10 years, Jamaica's bet seemed like the right investment, where their GDP was growing much more rapidly than Singapore. And if anyone's visited Jamaica recently and compared to Singapore, you understand the GDP situation has changed dramatically. That's the environment that we can build. So as we think about this digitization future, what's possible, what's potential, we need to have clarity on the expectation and outcomes, a connection and focus on education through all levels, vocational, higher education, primary and secondary learning, adult learning as part of the journey, and along the way, remember to celebrate the heroes in the continuum which that are teachers. Celebrate their innovation, inspire them to do more, embrace their need to fail to get better on the learning journey, and then along the way, embrace the opportunity to use data to drive progress and to use insight to drive better learning outcomes for students. And that's hopefully a good framing for the rest of the conversation and an exciting panel on data and analytics coming up. So thank you.